Hi, I'm Michael, and this is Maker's Workshop. Today, we're going to make a dog dish holder using resin and wood from the yard. Let's get started. Maple's old dog dish was just a cheap one from the local home goods store. It wasn't wearing up well to use because it was just a wooden construction that was sloppily made. She's a really messy eater, so we wanted to make her one that would hold up better to water and general use. Resin seemed like the perfect idea. We've made a lot of resin molds on our channel before, so I'm just going to breeze through this step. I grabbed some scrap plywood that I had laying around the workshop and some various pieces of odds and end wood that was laying around as well. I screwed them together to create one large, flat bottom panel for the mold. I'm making a really big panel because we decided to make two of these, one for the workshop and one for home. But you could do this project on a much smaller scale if you were only going to make one. After building the bottom, we brought it out into the main workspace and covered it with Tyvek tape. I made sure to overlap each one of the pieces of tape to minimize the risk of resin seeping underneath and getting stuck to the wood. You want to overlap by at least a ½ inch. I then repeated this process on the side panels for the mold, which was basically just going to look like a big box filled with Tyvek tape. I made the side pieces, but I didn't assemble the mold yet because I wanted to pick my wood first, lay it out so that I could build the sides of the box to be a pretty tight fit to minimize any resin waste. Alright, so since the dog's name is Maple, we thought that using some of this maple that's from our yard that we've cut and previously dried would be a fun little touch for the dog bowl. These are some of the branches from fallen trees in our yard. If you live in a wooded area, you'd be very surprised how much wood you can get this way. So next time you have a storm, you might consider slicing some up on the bandsaw and putting it out to dry. Once I selected the wood, I removed the bark using a draw knife. I then went back, off camera, and removed any wispies that were left with my orbital sander, just to make sure that none of them went floating when I started pouring the resin. I then laid my pieces out in an orientation that I liked. Once I was happy with the placement of the wood, I marked the outside of the design so that I could go back and put the mold together. I covered the side pieces with Tyvek tape as well, and then screwed it all into place. I then went back and put additional Tyvek on the inside seams and sealed the corners really well to ensure that there are no leaks. Then I loaded my mold up with the wood again and put a little bit of hot glue to hold it into place. Because it was just scrap wood, some of the boards were quite warped because I hadn't put them through the finished milling process yet. To account for this, I took some old pieces of strapping and I cut them to the width of the mold. I spaced them evenly. I clamped one side down, and then I screwed the other side into the side of the mold to hold the wood firmly to the bottom of the mold. It looked a little crazy, but it worked like a charm. At this point, it was time to start mixing the resin. I'm using Total Boat 2:1, and I colored it with Ranger alcohol inks and diamond pigment powders. Since this mold was going to be thicker than 1/4 inch, I needed to pour it in multiple layers, no thicker than 1/4 inch at a time. Otherwise, it would get bubbles in it from the exothermic reaction during the curing process. To achieve this, I mix up a batch at a time, and I pour it in until it's about 1/4 inch thick. Then I would wait 20 to 40 minutes until the resin would hit the gel state. The way that you can tell that the resin is at the gel state is if you tap it with a small piece of wood and pull it up. If it holds its shape for a little bit before sinking back down into the resin, then it's probably pretty close to gel phase. This took 3 or 4 buckets full before it was finally done. But again, I was making a very large panel, and if you're only making one of these, it would drastically reduce the amount that you needed to use. 4. Maple was pretty enamored by the process, and she stood guard over that panel until it was ready to use. We let it sit overnight, then set to removing it from the mold. I started by taking the screws out of the sides and the spacers. And then I used the hammer and the pry bar to separate the panel from the mold. Since the panel was so large, it did take a good amount of work to get the panel out of the mold. But it looked great. I started the finishing process for the panel by using my power hand planer. It was too wide for my benchtop planer, so I needed to do it this way. Once I got it pretty much level, I switched over to the drum sander to get a nice flat surface. After I finished running it through the drum sander, some voids had exposed themselves, so I went back with a little more Total Boat 2-to-1 epoxy, and I just filled in those areas. After that set up, I measured out my panels and I cut them into smaller pieces before running them through the drum sander one last time. Once I had my finished panels, it was time to start doing the design for the CNC router. I'm using Easel Pro, but it's a pretty simple CNC design, so any program that you are comfortable using should work for this one. I started by making an outline of a rectangle in the size that I wanted the finished dish holder to be. Then I added 2 circles that were the right size for the dog dish to drop into, while the lip of the bowl could hold it in place. In whatever program you're using, you just want to make sure that you use whatever functions are available to you to line these up so that they're perfectly centered to the rectangle. My final step was to add tabs so that the pieces wouldn't go flying as it was cut out. Easel has a tab function, but for larger pieces, we've sometimes had mixed results, so I made my own tabs by creating one long, narrow rectangle at a 0 cut depth. And then it was time to bring my panel over to the CNC router. I put the panel into place and clamped it down securely before running the program. Runtime on this was about 30 minutes, and the X-Carve did most of the heavy lifting from here. So this is all carved. Let's take it out and see what we have. That's looking pretty good. I then use the jigsaw to quickly remove the tabs and separate all the pieces. I filed the little nubs that were left from the tabs, and then I went over the whole thing with the random orbital sander to a 400 grit before setting it aside to start working on the stand. I came up with a design that used 1/4-inch steel rod and some 1-inch flat stock. I started by cutting all of my pieces to the right lengths. I used the angle grinder to cut the steel rods, and my chop saw to cut the flat stock. I needed a couple of rectangles out of the flat stock and a couple of trapezoid shapes because they were going to become the brackets for mounting the top to the base. After cutting all the pieces to length, I used a hand file to neaten up the edges. And then I marked halfway points on all the pieces from the flat stock so I could pre-drill the holes for mounting. To do this, I taped the flat stock down to the drill press table and I lubricated the drill bit using some WD-40. These two steps together will increase the lifespan of your drill bit and keep it from going flying on you. I counted up my pieces, and once I was sure that I had everything, it was time to weld it together. I started by welding the basic frame. And then measuring and placing the remainder of the legs so that they were just spaced equidistant and looked nice and symmetrical. I then went back through and I tack welded all of the flat stock to the frame for mounting to the resin. For this particular project, I left the welds as they were because it didn't really feel necessary to bring it to a more finished state. But you obviously could file or grind and then wire brush and finish this to whatever extent you wanted to for the look that you're going for. After verifying that the top fit on the base the way that I envisioned, I brought the piece inside and I marked where the screw holes were going to be. I then drilled pilot holes using a small drill bit, being extra careful not to punch all the way through the front side of the resin. At this point, I wiped the entire panel down with paint thinner to remove any excess dust, and then after letting that dry, I went back and I did 2 coats of wipe-on polyurethane in a satin finish. I thought that this would give it a nice durable coating while maintaining some of that natural feel of the wood. After the polyurethane was fully dried, I mounted the base to the panel . It looked great, but it was pretty noisy, so I added some felt to the bottom of the legs. And with that, the project was ready to go home. And Maple was super excited when she saw it walk through the door. Alright, so this is the second one that we made, and this one's going to stay at the shop. I just need to grab the bowls for it and they'll be ready to go. Overall, I'm really excited about how this panel technique came out. I think that this just created a stunning patterning with the contrast between the wood and the resin, and I think that I will definitely try using this technique in some future projects because I think this has a lot of possibilities. And then the other thing that was kind of cool for this project is we were able to do it with pretty much no waste because we were able to take the center circle cutouts and we coated them with a mineral oil, and these will make a great cheese board. Since there is resin, you don't want to cut on them, but for display or presentation, these will be fantastic. If you like this project or found this content helpful, don't forget to subscribe.